Hello, everyone. Let's start today's Super Salon. Welcome you all to today's Super Salon hosted by me, Arkadiusz Synowczyk. I'm a philosophy student, and today we are welcoming Kevin J. Mitchell. Kevin is an associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. He's the author of Innate, how the wiring of our brains shapes who we are, as well as today's discussed free agents, how evolution gave us free will, and he also runs a popular blog, Wiring the Brain. His work has appeared in publications such as Scientific American, The Guardian, and Psychology Today. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you
Thanks
for
very much.
coming.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming as well.
So today's format is with me to start by asking Kevin a couple of questions and then open the question period to the audience. And so maybe the first logical question would be to start by asking you, Dr. Mitchell, why is the topic of free will important at all? Why do you think your book, the ideas in your book, as well as the topic of free will, matters at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. And someone asked me that recently, except they asked it in a different way. They asked it, they said, look, whether you claim to believe in free will or not, everyone behaves as if we have free will. So what's the point? It's just academic semantics then. So I think it's of interest to me just because it's an age-old philosophical question, but there's a deeper question about agency, really, which is just within biology, a fundamental property of living organisms is that they do things. And we don't have a good kind of conceptual framework to understand that. We don't have a theory of agency. We just don't understand really in a solid way how it could be. What's the difference between a living organism like a frog sitting on a rock that can do things by itself, that seems to be a causal agent in the world, versus the rock that it's sitting, where things might happen to it or near it or even in it, but it's not doing anything. So fundamentally, I think there's a key sort of question there in biology about how we should think about agency. And what I wanted to do was try and put that on a kind of a naturalized footing. But there's a few other reasons as well. One is that many of the sort of clinical conditions that neuroscientists, neurologists, psychiatrists, psychologists are interested in affect agency in some way or another. They affect our ability to control our own behavior. You can think about things like ADHD or schizophrenia or dementia or drug addiction or compulsions and so on, where aspects of what we sort of colloquially refer to as our free will get impaired in some way. And we need to have a way of thinking about those, right? We need to have a framework of thinking about those that avoids the trap of just falling into the idea that it's all just mechanism, right? That there's something broken in the brain somewhere and that's the reason why behavior is different, right? We need to have, in my view, a science of cells. We need to understand that people are not just machines, right? Of course, all of those functions that we rely on to regulate our own behavior depend on neural machinery, but we are not just the neural machinery. And again, what I wanted to have is a sort of a naturalized framework where we can have that science of the systems of behavioral control that doesn't make the person disappear in the process. And then the other reason that I think is very interesting and really topical is around the possibility of artificial life, artificial consciousness and sentience, and artificial agency. So a lot of we have these debates about artificial intelligence and whether these systems are sentient in any way and what that would even mean. And I think a lot of that actually hinges on what we understand as agency and autonomy. What would it mean for a system like that to be an autonomous agent, not just to be able to do complicated mathematical calculations or computations, but to be an entity with some causal power, a locus of causal power itself. So those are the some of the sort of broad motivating areas and themes that I think are interesting that make this not just a semantic, academic, philosophical exercise.
Speaking of a lack of a conceptual framework in semantics, how do you define the concept of free will? Because there is a huge debate about this. People do this differently,
Yeah,
and defining free will differently is, of course, a source of various disagreements
sure.
among people.
Yeah, and I think actually looking at the literature, that a lot of the disagreements come from people defining it differently from the get-go, either explicitly or implicitly, and then proceeding with these different understandings, and then just talking past each other. Right? So that includes, for example, if you ask the question, "Do we have free will?" then you have to explain or define what free is and what will is. But more fundamentally, you have to explain what we refers to, right? What does that mean, we? What's the self or the entity that you're talking about? And there's disagreements about all of those things. So I took the tack in the book, and it's one I defend, of not defining it from the get-go, because I think if we had a definition that everyone agreed on that was unproblematic, we'd be done, right? We just would have we'd have an understanding. The definition would encapsulate that. Obviously, we don't. So what I wanted to do was just sort of try to approach the phenomenon that we're interested in explaining. And the phenomenon for me, and I think, for many people, when we're talking about free will, is the idea that you are somehow in charge of your own actions, right? That you can exercise behavioral control, that you can cause things to happen in the world, that if you do something, you can say, yes, I did that. It wasn't just something that happened to me or in me that made me do it. I did it. I decided to. I had reasons for doing it. I can articulate what those reasons are. I can inspect those reasons. I can change my mind if I want to. All of those capacities for what I think we can just call rational control of our behavior fall under what I think colloquially people mean when we use the term free will, as in I did that of my own free will. And so that's the starting point. And then the question is, well, how could it be that you can do things for reasons? How can you be a cause of things at all in the universe with physical laws and so on? And so, yeah, that opens up this broad kind of set of questions, but that's the phenomenon that I'm after here.
Okay, so one of the major ways to both define and understand free will is a view called compatibilism. It is a view that says, okay, yes, things are deterministic, things can only go one way, but it's still compatible with free will. What is your view on compatibilism and in
Yeah.
general?
So I'm not a fan of it. I find it very confusing and somewhat incoherent. And I was taken to task recently for using that word incoherent as if I meant it kind of flippantly, and I don't. I mean it. I mean that the premises of the argument don't cohere with each other. First of all, I want to say a lot of the debate in philosophy takes the following form. It assumes that determinism, however defined, is true. And then it says, what are the implications of that for free will? You can end up, if you take that premise as true and you define it in the sense of what I call physical predeterminism, which means that the current state of the universe plus the laws of physics entail just one subsequent state of the universe, right? So there's no branching, there's no possibilities. It's just, we know everything about the universe right now, and we put it through the whatever it's level you want to do it at, Newton's laws or Maxwell's laws or Schrodinger equation or whatever it is. And there's one solution to that exercise, and that's the next state of the universe. And then you do it again and again and again, and there's just one sacred timeline that runs forever, forward and backward. No branching, no possibility. So that's the starting premise for a lot of those debates. I'm going to maybe come back a little bit and just say there's no reason whatsoever why that should be the starting premise, because physics absolutely doesn't say that that's the case. But let me just describe the sort of two two ways that you can go if you accept that premise. One is free will skepticism. You just say, look, there could never be any choice in that kind of a universe. What are you choosing between? The atoms are just going to do whatever they're going to do. You can't have any causal power. There's no room left, right? All the causation is happening at the very, very lowest level. And that's just going to determine the next state of the universe. What does it care? What does it matter what you want? There's no wants. There's no trying. There's nothing matters. There's no counterfactual possibilities. There's just whatever's going to happen will happen. To me, that's actually a perfectly reasonable extrapolation to make if you take determinism seriously. However, the more popular version is compatibilism, and that comes in a few flavors. So one of them is that actually we can have free will and we can make free choice even in that kind of a universe. Now, that's really, really hard to defend, and it just makes no sense at all to me for the reasons I just said. But there's another version which is more subtle, which is that you can defend moral responsibility, which is what many people in the free will debate care about, right? The payoff is moral responsibility. You can defend that even if there's no branching possibilities or you didn't really make a choice. And the argument there is that you are a complicated being that and your physical structure embodies some reasons for you doing things. And therefore, even if you would always have done the same thing under those circumstances, it was still because of you, right? You're still the source of that. So that's a view called source causation. And it's a very popular one, but to me, it's just kind of a fudge. I still don't, and in two ways. One, again, if there are no choices available to you, then I think even using terms like doing or acting or choosing is weird, right? You didn't choose or you didn't do anything. Things happen. They were always going to happen, regardless. So this idea of distinguishing loci of causation in a fully physically deterministic universe makes no sense to me. There wouldn't be such a thing as entities that are loci of causation. The second aspect of that I really find odd is that a lot of the thought experiments in the literature around this, where they get pretty arcane about whether you can say someone was responsible even if they had no choice. Things like, oh, I was going to kill my uncle, and then an evil neurosurgeon put a chip in my brain and he wanted to kill my uncle, and then at the last minute I decided not to, but I did anyway. And then am I still responsible because I never had any? It's just weird stuff, frankly. But the problem I have with those thought experiments is they start with the existence of these agents. They start with me. They start with my uncle. How the hell did we, pardon my French, how did we arise in a universe like that? Why are there things like us in a universe where everything is determined by what happens at the lowest levels? It makes no sense to me. Well, at least let me say, I think the burden of proof is on the people who are going to make those arguments to explain in the first place, not just assume that such agents exist and go from there, but to explain how they could come to exist in a universe that is like that. Now, thankfully, the universe is not like that. So in one sense, that's all moot.
Yes, it also strikes me as a peculiar view and maybe a way of redefining away the problem, defining free will in a way that you have it. But it's not about simply us being the source of the action if the choice is determined. So it's similar to saying, I will define free will as having a beard. I have a beard, therefore I have free will. But that's not the point. That's not the point, of course. Nevertheless, compatibilism is a very popular view. I think according to one survey, about 90% of philosophers were upholding to this view. I'm not sure, but it's very popular.
That's right. And I just want to say one other thing about it that kind of bothers me just from an intellectual point of view, which is that it feels like, and it's often explicitly declared as, an exercise in motivated reasoning, where it's like, how can we defend moral responsibility in the face of this supposed evidence from physics that the world is deterministic? And it's really, it's almost a kind of a theological way of arguing. It's like, here's the here's where we want to end up. Now, how can we construct an edifice of argument that lets us get there, right? And I just think that's not, to me, that's not, it's not intellectually a good way to go. Let me just put it like that. It's not, it leads us to very tortuous kinds of arguments and people tying themselves up in knots, frankly, in ways that I just don't find convincing or necessary.
Yes, maybe scholasticism has not left us entirely, but if not compatibilism, how is free will possible in the world where we have objects, particles, behaving seemingly in a way that allows only for one way to go? An apple has to fall where it falls, and that's all. How, in essence, is your answer to this problem?
Sure. So, well, first, let me say that, again, the phenomenon that we're interested in, right? If you drop an apple at the top of a hill, it's going to roll downhill, right? If you drop a pigeon at the top of a hill, something else might happen, right? If you drop a mouse at the top of a hill, something else might happen, right? So that's the distinction that we're interested in. How can mice and pigeons do things that apples can't do, right? What's the distinction between living things with agency and, in this case, I guess, an alive thing without agency, but you could compare it to a stone. So let's start with the physics. I said that I don't think the universe is like that. And in fact, physics hasn't proven that the universe is deterministic. In fact, quite the opposite. So I think, many people may be familiar with the fact that at quantum level, a lot of things that happen are probabilistic. So the Schrodinger equation that I referred to earlier, which describes the so-called wave function of some system, describes very deterministically how that wave function will evolve through time until such a point as some interaction happens when the wave function, which is actually a description of a set of probabilities of the states of things like electrons or photons or other particles within the system, until there's some interaction that forces that to collapse to one of those probabilities apparently at random, right? There's no extra force that does that. It follows the probabilities. If you did loads of experiments, you'd see the probability density function in your array of results. But for any one of those, it appears to be a random, uncaused, at least not predetermined kind of thing. So that's at the lowest level of reality. Now, many people would say, okay, that's fine. Quantum stuff is weird. We know it's weird, but there's what I call the Las Vegas argument, which is that what goes on in the quantum realm stays in the quantum realm. Okay, so when we get to classical levels, this high level of big macroscopic objects like you and me, there we are subject to the laws of classical physics. So Newton's equations, Maxwell's equations, and so on. And we know from physics that Newton's equations are deterministic. Right? There's no probability within the equations themselves. That's why we can predict the orbits of the planets. It's why we can predict eclipses hundreds of years out and so on. Now, that's the impression that we've been given, mainly because Newton started with things like the orbits of the planets, right? Really, really simple sorts of systems. They're these very dispersed things with only a small number of forces, just gravity, working on them. So it turns out if you make the systems even a little bit more complicated, then this predictability goes out the window. And there's two ways of looking at that. One is to say, well, it goes out the window just because we don't have the computational power or we don't know all of the details. But the details do exist, and in a sense, the universe is doing the computations and it's producing the unique solutions. So the future is defined, it's just that we don't know what it is. But there's really no evidence to support that. There's no experimental evidence to support that. And in fact, it relies on the idea that the entire state of the universe right now, at any moment actually, can be given or exist with infinite precision. Okay, so the way I think about that is like, imagine you were you're trying to predict the weather, and you're recording all this data, and it's pretty precise, but it goes to like 5 decimal points or 6 decimal points or something like that. And then you run your simulation for what the weather is going to be like over the next few days. What you're going to find, and this is classic, results from Lorenz, is that if you run it multiple times, where the numbers change very, very slightly at these distant points, then over the first few days, the predictions will be the same, but at some point they'll start to diverge. And then this is when the far digits come into play, as it were. And then over time, they'll just become completely unlike each other at all, right? There's no predictive power whatsoever beyond a certain point, because the small little variations in precision here start to affect things after a certain time horizon. So the question then is, could it possibly be the case that, in fact, in the universe, those parameters exist? It's just that we can't measure them. And there's very good evidence to think that they can't, because, I mean, there's multiple arguments. One of them is that any information requires some physical space. Okay? It can't just be immaterial kind of thing. So infinite information, that is, those numbers having precise values out to infinity, would require infinite physical space. And there's all sorts of physics theoretical arguments and theorems to prove that that couldn't possibly be the case. So I realize, sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but the end point, or the upshot of this, is that, in fact, the idea that even classical physics is fully deterministic is an idealization, right? It's an assumption. It's not a result of physics. And it breaks down the minute you have complex systems with nonlinear interactions, right? Very unlike the orbits of the planets, but more like the weather, where any little thing can get amplified in ways that are really, really unpredictable and complicated. Okay, so how am I doing on that? Does that make sense? Because the next bit relies on the idea that we can think about the universe as not being fully deterministic, but also that doesn't mean that everything is just random, right? And it doesn't mean that some things are completely deterministic and there's this little sprinkling of randomness as an extra thing that enters the universe somehow, right? Instead, it's a view where things are partly determined, but not completely. The parameters of the universe are partly defined, but not completely. And so what we have is a negative, right? The randomness is not a positive extra thing. It's just a lack of complete determination at the lowest level. And what that does is that's going to open the door. It means all the causation is not exhausted at the lowest levels, because the current state of the universe plus the laws of physics doesn't fully dictate what's going to happen next. It opens the door for other kinds of causation to come into play. Did that make sense? I know that was a lot.
I think the argument was clear to me, and if there is something remaining, we'll come back to this in the open question period.
Okay,
no,
sorry,
please continue.
There's a follow-on then from where that gets you. So a rejoinder to that many people make would be to say, okay, so I've noticed that philosophers like to name their arguments, so I've started naming arguments. So this one I call the either way you're screwed argument. Okay, so this means, like, either the universe is fully deterministic, in which case you're not in control and you have no free will, or the things that happen at the lowest level are a bit random sometimes, but what happens overall is still determined by those things, right? It's still reductive in that sense, and therefore you're also not in control, because I can't control the random stuff that happens, right? I'm not in charge of that. So either way, you don't have any free will. But that ignores the really important point here, which is that the existence of this slight indeterminacy or indefiniteness creates what some people call causal slack in the system, right? It means the causation is not exhausted by everything that's going on down here. Instead, you can have a system that's organized a certain way, where the organization of the system constrains what will happen. And that's, like, it's not a mystical kind of a thing. It's just that constraints are a kind of a cause, and they're not just physical forces, but they determine or constrain how the physical forces play out, right? So in the way that water flowing in a pipe is constrained by the way the pipe is, right? So physicists just call that the boundary conditions of a system, and it's not you can't know those. Those aren't part of the laws of the universe. They're part of the state of the universe, but in an organizational sense, right? So they're macroscopic kind of order parameters. And what that means is that you can get a system where the macroscopic organization is not just constraining things, but it's doing it for a function. And we are, right now, all of us using machines that are designed like that, right? So our laptops or whatever computers we're using are constraining the flow of electrons within them to some function, which is what the designers and the software engineers and so on had in mind. Right? And there's nothing that doesn't violate the laws of physics. We're not changing the physical forces that are the types of physical forces that are acting on electrons or the way that they behave in response to those. We're just constraining the shape, the landscape of those forces. Right? And by doing that, what's happening in the technology is that constrains the possibility space of what happens. Right? Many things could have happened, but because these electrons are in these transistors, they're channeled in certain directions. So life works exactly the same way. You know, if we think about a living being, what is the simplest kind of form of life, a single-celled organism? What it is a constraint regime, right? It's a set of processes, set of enzymatic reactions and metabolic reactions and so on that are all reinforcing and feeding back on each other to create this metastable pattern of activity. And that pattern of activity persisting through time is what we call life. And living things have to do work in order to keep that pattern going. So they have to resist the second law of thermodynamics, they have to take in free energy, and they have to keep supplying the energy to maintain this thermodynamically unlikely arrangement of matter and processes. So naturally, what happens is that they evolve patterns that give them a functionality that encourages their persistence. So if you have two patterns, one of which is really good at persisting, right? It's a very stable kind of configuration, and another one which is less stable, well, the less stable one is just going to disappear, right? We only see the ones that persist. That's exactly what life is. So that selection for persistence grounds the idea, first of all, of purpose, just pragmatically in that sense, right? The ones that persist better, that are organized in that way, will be the ones that keep on keeping on. But it also grounds the idea of functionalities within that organization, right? It's not just a big random thing. Various bits of that are for different things. They're for taking in energy, they're for doing replication, they're for enzymatic reactions, and they're for sensing things out in the world and for reacting appropriately. So that's where we start to see, even in the very simplest organisms, the beginnings of action and agency and goal-directedness. That's completely different from any other kind of causation in the physical world that, in a sense, transcends that without violating, right? Because it's an extra layer of macroscopic constraint. I hope that was clear.
Let's maybe touch on one objection that might be raised to this. So right now we spoke of something like a chain of causation going downward instead of going upwards from the particles to molecules and so on. And how would you answer to the objection that downward causation from the function of an organism is also simply deterministic? Why wouldn't that be so? Why wouldn't it constrain things in a way that simply makes us determined?
All right. Okay, good. So I'm gonna take this argument all the way up to human beings. Okay, so there's a way that you can talk about determinism which doesn't rely on this physical determinism. Instead, it's transposed to either, say, neural determinism, where the circuits in your brain are just going to fire a certain way because they're configured a certain way, or even psychological determinism, where you can say, look, you are the way you are. Your mind is the product of millions of years of evolution that led to the human lineage, of your own genetics, of the way that your brain happened to develop in utero and subsequently of all the experiences that have happened to you and of any other sorts of environmental things that are happening right now. Okay. And then because of all of that stuff, that when you encounter some new scenario and you are deciding what to do, in fact, all of those complex computations will always produce one particular outcome, right? It's deterministic what will happen, even if it feels like you're making decisions. Basically, you would always make the same decision. Your brain would always come to the same conclusion, that there's one right thing to do. And so people like Robert Sapolsky, Stanford neuroscientist, makes that argument. I don't find it, there's no evidence for it. There's loads of evidence for an influence of genetics and environment and experience on our personality and our cognition and so on. There's no evidence that all of those influences add up to a deterministic sort of picture with only one outcome, right? And in fact, it kind of is very, very hard to see how that could work. And it sort of undercuts the whole point of having cognition, right? The reason that we have evolved complex cognitive systems is precisely in order to deal with novel scenarios that we've never encountered before, that we can't just have a pre-configured lookup table to just refer to say, in scenario A, I must do X, and in scenario B, I must do Y, right? The whole reason that we have this complex cognitive system is precisely because scenarios don't arise where they're just A or just B in isolation, right? So like a stimulus response kind of a thing. Instead, there's all kinds of parameters happening, right? So, and we don't know how to weight them. So even for a bacterium, it may be configured in such a way that it would go towards a food source, right? But what happens if there's a different food source over here? What happens if there's also a threat right next to the food source? What should it do then? Because it has a separate policy for what to do in response to a threat. So now these things are being presented at the same time. Now it needs an internal system to adjudicate over all of that, right? It has to make, in a sense, an all things considered judgment. Now, judgment is a strong word for a bacterium, but it's not a strong word for us. That's exactly what we have to do. That's what our cognitive processes entail. And your question was, well, okay, but why wouldn't all that top-down stuff still be deterministic? And the answer partly is, first, that it couldn't be pre-stated in all the complexity of every scenario we would ever encounter. But secondly, that we're dealing with noisy components. And so all of this indeterminacy that we're talking about at very low level of physics manifests at slightly higher level as thermal fluctuations and molecules bouncing around, and they're wet, jiggly components, right? So we're not made out of nicely behaving silicon. We're made out of warm, wet, small, jiggly, jittery stuff that bounces around, okay? And things that bind and unbind and so on in probabilistic fashion. So cells have to deal with all that noise and still sort of be able to do their functions. And the nervous system has to be able to deal with noisy components and still do its functions to, within a certain sort of margin of successful outcomes. But there's no way to actually constrain all of those things. That noise is still going on. So when you get to a really, really complex system with all of the cognitive apparatus that's involved, all of those processes happening, there just is no way physically for that to manifest in exactly the same way every time you run the system from some hypothetical starting point, unless the world were really physically deterministic. So in fact, that viewpoint of psychological or cognitive determinism, in essence, rests on a notion of physical determinism, which just isn't true.
Okay, thank you for an answer. My last question before opening all of this to the audience is, in your argument for free will, does it necessarily depend on the indeterminacy at the quantum level, the literal metaphysical indeterminacy? Because of course it's the usual story told by physicists that things are simply indeterminate at the quantum level, not simply that we can't predict them, but that they are not specific. They are not A or non-A. They are not specific. And some people, especially in philosophy of physics, might question this. And so my question would be, is your argument dependent on indeterminacy at the quantum level?
Yes and no. I think you can make a separate argument at the classical level. Which physicists like Nicolas Gisin and others have made, and that's what I was referring to earlier about this impossibility of having infinite information at any one time slice of the universe that contains all the information about all subsequent and previous time slices. There's also good empirical evidence that can't be the case, but again, it gets into a lot of complex physics, and some of it's frankly above my pay grade. But I look at the metaphysical arguments around it, and I don't see any good support for a fully deterministic view. So really, what makes sense to me is to start with the viewpoint of an indeterminate universe, and then to flip the script, right? So if you start with determinism, then you have this big problem. Where does the freedom come from in free will, right? How could there be any freedom? But if you start with indeterminacy, if you just accept what the picture from physics that I've described, well, then you have a different question. Then you have to ask, well, okay, here's an organism. It's faced with all this wide array of potential futures. Load of things could happen. Well, now, where does the control come from? And that control, what the organism is doing is saying, okay, here's the range of things that could happen. Now I want to make this happen, right? And sometimes it's this really one specific thing. Sometimes it's kind of a range of things, right? It's like, I don't really care exactly how it happens at this very, very minute detail. I just care that such and such happened, right? So I think of that as a sort of a principle of sufficient control. That's what the organism has to exercise. It doesn't have to reach down and try and affect these sort of indefinite things that are happening. It just has to constrain the possibility space into a region that it finds desirable to the level of detail that it needs. So if I want to take a drink, I have a glass of wine next to me here, and I have a glass of water next to me there, right? And if I'm really thirsty, I could say, well, I'm going to have one of those. And I might not care which one. As it happens, I prefer the wine right now. That's fine. Okay. But say I go to choose drink my glass of wine, and that's my decision. But I could do it with my left hand or my right hand, and I could do it this way or that way. There's lots of ways that I could do it. I don't care. Right. So I only have to control it to the degree that I care about. And that's going to differ across different scenarios. So in some scenarios, I'm going to really, really care. I'm going to have very strong reason to do one thing. And if we did this sort of classical rewind the tape experiment and ask, could I have done otherwise? Or would I have done otherwise? Or would otherwise have happened? Then I would say, well, actually, no, I would always do the same thing because I had really strong reasons to do it. So why wouldn't I? And I'm doing it, even though it's in a sense determined. It's determined by me having those reasons. But in another circumstance, I might be indifferent, or I might be undecided for various reasons. I might not know what the best thing is to do. And then sometimes it might go one way and sometimes it might go the other way. And some people would say, well, that's just luck then, right? Your decision was just made by luck. It was just randomness that chose whether you did A or B. But that to me is just ignoring the fact that I had reasons to do A or B. I didn't have strong reasons to decide between A or B, but I had reasons to do both A and B. And then, whichever one that happens, I can defend why I did it for the reasons that I did it. So, and also it ignores the fact of all the work that I've done in narrowing down the possibility space from this broad array to here, A or B, right? So I may not care if A or B happens, but I care that A or B happens as opposed to something else happening. So, so for me, I guess what I want to do there is just illustrate the fact that there's not one answer. There's not one scenario when we're deciding things. Sometimes we're in very familiar, habitual scenarios. We already know what to do because we've thought about it loads of times before. Sometimes we're in a scenario where we have a very strong reason to choose one thing, and we'll do that for our own reasons. Sometimes we're in a scenario where the multiple things could happen, but we're still going to choose one of them. We're going to narrow that down for our reasons. But there's going to be some randomness at play in the actual outcome under those scenarios as well. I hope that answered your question, Arkadiusz.
Okay, so as promised, I now open the question period for everyone. As there is not too big of a crowd, you can simply raise your hand and ask your question for a microphone or raise any issue. Or if you are a little bit shy, you can also ask via the chat and I will simply read the question out.
All right, let me have it.
Jenny and Mark, you're welcome
Hi.
to ask whatever you want.
Thank you. This is really interesting. Really appreciate it. Maybe you can help me formulate this question too. But I'm wondering, do you think there's a difference between, okay, so before listening to your presentation, I tend to think that, okay, I can do otherwise in the future based on what I've learned from previous choices. So I made a choice then that maybe now I regret, but hey, now I've learned I can do otherwise now. Do you think there's a difference between that and I could have done otherwise in the past? Because I tend to think, okay, given every single factor that was at play, I couldn't actually have done otherwise then, but I can. Like, do you see a difference between those two things?
Yeah, I do. I understand the different articulation there. And in one sense, you know, the idea that you could learn from things and that would change your behavior in the future is, in a sense, you're sort of passive in that, right? So you're still not making choices in the moment because your brain is telling you there's one thing to do right now at any given time, but then your brain learns some stuff and then your brain is different the next time. And so what it does in a sense is it means that you are almost not in control and your brain is in control. And that's a weird way to talk. I don't mean it's weird for you. I just mean that framing, the way I'm framing it, right? The difference between you and your brain is this really dualist intuition. The idea that if you're that you are somehow separate from your brain, you have to be separate from your physical form or your biology somehow to count as being in charge. If it's all just biological, then it's not you. And I referred to Robert Sapolsky earlier, and Robert has a book out that came out just at the same time as mine, which is interesting because he makes the exact opposite claims to me, that we're completely determined in this kind of a way. And, you know, I just don't buy the idea that every time we learn something about how our brain works when we're making a decision, that means a little bit of you disappears, right? The more biology we learn, the less you there is left. It's all just biology. That just seems like a weird framing, because what else do you think there could be but biology, right? I mean, it's like the only thing that would satisfy is some kind of magical, mystical being, which he, you know, from the get-go says, well, that couldn't possibly be the case. But in a sense, he defines the idea of real control as a person, as a self, out of existence from the get-go, because he says if it's biological, then it's not the self. And that to me is an odd kind of a framing or premise to start with. So what I would say is that in any given circumstance, first of all, that, you know, I referred to the could have done otherwise experiment because it's common thought experiment, because it's commonly discussed in the literature. I'm not a fan of it, frankly, because it's a weird way of thinking, and partly because it privileges what happened the first time, right? So you say, okay, here I was in this circumstance and I did A. And then when you go back, you have to say, how could I possibly do other than A? Right? It already in your mind, A is privileged as this thing that was the outcome, and you have to explain how there could be something else, right? So if you don't start with that, if you just say from this moment now, here I am, I'm choosing my words, right? And I'm thinking through various words that I could put in an order here to convey the ideas that I want to convey. And there's a lot of possible ones, and now I'm confusing myself because I'm literally thinking about it as I'm doing it, right? But I don't in any sense feel like it's determined what I'm going to say right now. It feels like there are real options open to me, and the way that my brain circuits are operating are part of the mechanisms that I'm using to make those decisions. And so there's two ways to see that, right? Either you can say, when we, you know, say we do an fMRI experiment and we see when somebody's doing A, B, or C that this part of their brain gets active, or this part or so on, you can say, look, it wasn't you making that decision. It was that part of your brain or this part, right? It was your brain making the decision. That's one way to see it. The other way to see it is to say, well, when I'm making a decision, I use my brain to do that. Because what else would I use? Of course, I'm using my brain, right? So you can look at this sort of evidence from neuroscience in two ways. And that's just depending on the premise that you bring to it, of whether you have this sort of dualist intuition or not. But also, I think just in terms of our everyday experience, it doesn't feel to me like my choices are narrowed to one all the time. I often feel undecided. I often vacillate. I often change my mind as I'm going along. And we have very good sort of understanding of how that can all work at a neural level. There's nothing about that that's sort of mysterious in how that could be instantiated. And like I said, if you're using those noisy components, and you're doing, it's not just that the components are noisy, it's that we're trying to optimize over so many different goals at once. There's so many different variables and parameters, right? We're not just responding to one thing at a time in the way that people set up these binary choice experiments. We're trying to manage and guide our behavior through time with all these nested kind of goals over timelines of different length that may be conflicting with each other. And we're having to make an all things considered judgment with information that's incomplete and uncertain. Some of it may be wrong, it may be ambiguous, and we're trying to do it in finite time with noisy machinery. And so the idea that all of that every time would just be one outcome always just doesn't make any sense to me in terms of the actual operation of what's happening. And I don't think there's any evidence for it. That was a long-winded response. I'm sorry. But does that address your?
I think I am understanding what you're saying. Just to clarify, I always feel that I can do otherwise, and whether that's in the past or now. So I'm not denying that one feels like one can always do otherwise. Yeah. The things I'm pondering are more: is it really true? Just because I feel it, doesn't mean that it's actually true. So I just wonder about, like, given every single factor, external, internal, I mean, psychological, but also the world. I mean, literally every single factor coming in. Is it really true at that moment? If literally nothing had been different, a different outcome could happen.
Yeah,
that's what I wonder about. And and so you would, yes, I would say I'm still not sure. Although I do think that now I can learn and create a different outcome. Did you want to?
Can I just say one thing before you come back in? When you're talking about this feeling, right? So I've referred to this as if it's evidence of something. And what I want to say actually is that this is the phenomenology of our experience. And if you're going to propose a theory that says all of that phenomenology is an illusion, then I think you've got a high bar to meet, right? Whereas if you're proposing a theory that says, yeah, actually that matches that phenomenology, then to me that's a point in its favor. It's not decisive, but it's a point in its favor. So I take those feelings to be reflecting reality, because that seems like a reasonable place to start when thinking about what those feelings are.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm just pondering this. I don't have a clear question to articulate, but I feel like what you said in the beginning, I don't believe that we have a self separate from the brain. I think we have an experience of it, but in a sense, the fact that we can learn from experience and make a choice, a different choice the next time, feels like free will. But of course, it all depends on how you define free will.
Well, it also depends on how you define the self, right? And so I think you've touched on something really, really important with this idea of learning through time. So yes, there's a conception of the self that's a sort of a naive conception of this little homunculus that sits inside your brain and that looks out through your eyes and that sees stuff and that pulls the levers and is the puppeteer of your body, right? And that's obviously not right. There isn't a place in your brain where the self lives. And Now, some people would say because that naive view is not right, then the self is an illusion, which just means it's not what we think it is. But then they make a stronger claim, which is to say that it's not real.
Right.
You can think of lots of things that aren't localizable, that are nevertheless real and real entities. So, for example, the Coca-Cola Corporation is a real entity, and it has real causal power as a corporation, as an entity. But you can't find it anywhere. You can't go to the Coca-Cola building and look within it and go, oh, here on the 10th floor, there it is. There's the corporation right there, right? It's a distributed thing. It has distributed powers of information gathering, and it has powers of executive control that are hierarchically distributed at various levels, depending on what type of thing is being controlled and over what sort of time frame. You know, it's strategic decisions at very high levels of the board and the CEO, and then more short-term decisions at the level of individuals at the salespeople for Coca-Cola, or people putting Coca-Cola in the vending machines, or whatever it is, right? So you can have an entity that is a distributed sort of a thing that nevertheless has causal power as an entity, even though you can't localize it. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to think about it. Now, the really important thing about that, what makes it a self and what makes an organism a self, is that it has continuity through time. Right? That's the only thing that makes it what it is that it continues being itself and stops it, right? It prevents its bits from becoming one with the universe, right? That's what a single cell bacterium is doing. It's keeping itself. Now, you can define selfhood in that way as physical continuity of a certain pattern, but when you get to more complicated things, you can define things like immunological selfhood, or psychological selfhood, or biographical selfhood. All of those things have something in common, which is historicity. That is, these kinds of systems, we just shouldn't think of them as just instantaneous physical systems that happen to be really complicated. We should think of them as a momentary instantiation of something that extends through time. And it's that extension through time that gives us causal power. It's exactly the fact that we've been learning from experience individually, but also that evolution did millions of years of learning from experience and packed that into us, right? And pre-configured our brains with good reasons and control policies around doing things. That's exactly what gives us causal power as loci within the universe. That's what makes us different from other kinds of physical systems that don't keep a record of their history as they go along. They don't learn from anything, right? And we do. That's why we can be causal agents, because we are, in a sense, just momentary avatars of this self that extends through time, right? At any moment, we're used to thinking of us as having spatial parts, right? We're an entity with parts, fingers, hands, heads, whatever. But we have temporal parts as well. And right now, I'm just one temporal part of myself, but myself extends through time. And I've learned from my past self to do things pretty much in the service of my future self. And that's where that agency comes from. And that's what it's for, in a sense.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for answer to this question too. Now it's Mike's turn to ask whatever he wants.
Hi. Well, thanks for a very interesting talk and book. Yeah, I was also struck by the fact that your book came out at the same time as Sapolsky's. So I was trying to read them kind of back to back and see if I could come up with some, grand synthesis that resolve the conflict. I don't know if I could, but I have dozens of different thoughts. Well, I like the example you gave in the last bit about the Coca-Cola Corporation. The self, I think the self is kind of like the Coca-Cola Corporation, which is it's a real thing with causal powers, but also a bit of a fiction. The Coca-Cola Corporation is this construct that people put together to achieve certain things, and I think the self is sort of like that too. But yeah. So what I wanted to say was so I'm gonna play Robert Sapolsky a bit, although
Okay.
I'm not really on his side, but let's for the sake of discussion. So I thought that you didn't quite address, I think, the strongest form of his argument, which is not that, I mean, there can be chaos, there can be chaotic physical phenomena or quantum indeterminacy, all of that stuff. None of that really matters. But the fact is that the brain, at least, is this causal machine, and it makes decisions, but it does not have the freedom to determine its own values. Those have been determined by evolution or culture or whatever. So you make choices, but but those choices aren't really free because you haven't that all of that stuff is given. And you can see that a bit in a bacteria. A bacteria might choose between two food sources, but presumably they're doing that on some mechanical basis. And I think Sapolsky would say that when we make our human choices, it's also being based on all this stuff. So we're not really, anyway. So okay, that's.
Oh, great. That's a great question, and I'm glad you raised it because it follows on from what I was just saying to Jenny and Mark there. So it's a slightly circular argument that Robert makes and that others make as well, Sam Harris, and goes back to Arthur Schopenhauer and many others, where the idea is you can do what you want at any moment. You can have some reasons, you can have some desires and motivations, and those can inform your action, right? So you're doing what you want, and it looks like agency, but you really didn't have any choice because you didn't choose your desires and motivations and so on. Now, and you didn't choose what your goals were. And it's circular because the only way to support that view is to say that you never could have chosen your goals or desires because at every moment you were in that kind of a situation, right? At every moment your past determines what you did, therefore you had no role in determining how you were configured in the next moment and the next and the next. It means you have no control over your own development. And I think that's a mistake. Again, it doesn't fit with our experience, and we do choose our goals. So I could choose to play a round of golf, and then I would be choosing the goal of hitting the little ball in the stupid little ball in the hole, right? And that having that goal would inform and constrain my behavior over the 4 hours or whatever it takes me to play a round of golf, usually longer. So just in terms of, again, our phenomenology, I think we do choose our goals. And as we do that, we set our agendas, and those constrain the activities that we want to do in order to achieve those goals, which in turn constrains the immediate motor actions that we choose in order to accomplish those activities as we go along. So there's a sort of nested set of control that we exercise at different time frames, and the long time frame ones constrain and inform the shorter time frame actions. Now, if in fact there's some freedom at every step along the way, then what that means is that we can actually choose some of our goals, or we can choose policies. We can actually, in a sense, actively develop our own character, right? Not just our personality traits, which I take to be sort of more innate and inborn biological factors, but they're fairly basic kind of things. But we can choose to be honest, for example. We can choose to be gracious. We can choose to be loyal. We can work on those things as skills, as character that we develop through time. So in a sense, what that means is that every choice that we make has some element of freedom in it, which in turn helps to shape us through time. So that when we come to any particular moment, it's just not the case that we were passively molded by things that we had no control over, right? We were partly influenced by past evolution and our genetics and our past experiences that happened to us, but we were also shaped by the history of choices that we made ourselves through time. And that's a view that goes back to Aristotle and Cicero and other philosophers who thought about these ideas of moral character and whether someone could be blamed for not just their actions, but for the way that they are, for the way that they allowed themselves to become, or even chose to become in an active kind of a sense. So I think there's a framework under which you can have a naturalized view of the development of our own character that we are involved in the past. It's not just stuff that has happened to us.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that makes a ton of sense. I guess for my question, you know, I wouldn't argue against the existence of selves or choices, but and I think the question is, you know, you have all that going on, and you also have this mechanical, deterministic, physical causation brain that's implementing or somehow underlying all of this stuff. And how do those layers fit together? I think that's the question.
Well,
I think your book has some interesting answers for that, I think. But
yeah, I would just say that it's not deterministic, right? I mean, you know, it is in a sense mechanistic, but actually, so this is a really crucial point. And so when you think about neural circuits firing, you can think about it in a couple of ways. You can think about, like, this neuron fires and it sends a little action potential down its axon, and it synapses onto another neuron, and it makes that neuron fire, right? So it's a driving feed forward view of what's happening in the nervous system. And that, you know, we've kind of inherited that from the work on reflex arcs, very simple sort of system, right? But actually, most of our nervous system is not like that at all. You can look at that thing with two neurons, this one's connected to that one, and say, actually, the active element here is this one. What it's doing is it's monitoring its inputs, and the weighting of its synaptic connections that's connecting to are what determine whether it pays attention to this guy or not. So you could have a bunch of action potentials that come down here that this guy completely ignores because they didn't all happen within a time window that it cares about. So if they don't all happen within 10 milliseconds or 50 milliseconds, it basically ignores them, right? So in a sense, what it's sensitive to is the information that's coming in, but in a way that's set by the criteria of what this neuron cares about, right? So it's filtering information. So actually, a lot of the low-level details of what happens here are lost, right? It could fire, as long as it fires, say, 5 action potentials within 50 milliseconds, this guy's going to fire. And it doesn't matter what the precise pattern is, that information's lost. This guy doesn't know that, it can't know that, and it can't convey that to anybody else. Right? All it cares about is, was the rate sufficient to drive this or not? So in a sense, what that means is that there's some meaning that can allow the system to be sensitive to the meaning of an incoming signal. And that might be, for example, that these two neurons that impinge on this one were active at the same time. And then if this one fires, the rest of the brain knows, oh, A and B occurred at the same time. And if this one doesn't fire, then A and B did not occur at the same time. So now what the system is doing is it's running on meaning. Of course, there's a neural instantiation to it, but actually the way the thing is configured, the low-level details don't matter. They get washed out, they get coarse-grained over, they get filtered actively in such a way that you end up with neural representations, so patterns of activity in your brain that carry meaning for the organism. So for example, you guys all right now, as you're looking at the screen, have activity in this part of your brain that's just in here, which is the so-called face area, or one of the areas that represents that there are faces out in the visual world. Now, that's not driving any particular response or action in any obligate kind of fashion. It's just a piece of information. It goes into the cognitive economy and you can think about it. And it can inform your behavior just like all the other bits of information that you have. Right? But what you do is not determined by the particular neural firings that represent the face. It's determined by the meaning of it. Right? And so what I want to do is really defend the idea that cognition is real. It's not just something that we can reduce to the neural level and say all the causal work is happening at the neural level. No, the neural level supports those cognitive things, but in a way that's, well, the technical term is multiply realizable. So you can realize those meanings in multiple different patterns. And to me, what that means is that we can have a neuroscience that doesn't explain away what we wanted to explain in the first place, which is how our minds work. It explains how they work without explaining it away, right? And and it can reconcile, various different sort of ideas about the philosophy of mind and how it rests on these neural substrates without ending up in an eliminative, reductive kind of a view. I better let Ethan in.
Thank you.
Thank you for answering it from Mitchell again. Now it's Ethan's turn.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for this wonderful breakdown of I think one thing that really stuck with me was the difference between something that was caused deterministically. I mean, say the Big Bang, right, and the laws of physics, and particularly Newtonian physics, versus things that have a random cause. I mean, going down to the quantum level, and it seems like this force of agency, and I am certainly on the side of free will existing. It seems kind of like a third force of nature, and I think some of what you talked about, just of how it came to be evolutionarily, I think it'd be interesting to dig a little bit more into that. I mean, we kind of discussed like the difference between a rock and a frog, and I mean the rock, it might have Newtonian physics acting on it, and I mean maybe not individual rock so much. It's not the impact of the randomness at the quantum level maybe isn't as noticeable in a single rock, but maybe when you're talking about the atmosphere in general and how unpredictable the weather is over periods of time, randomness is definitely a bit more of a force. But thinking of somewhere in between, like a plant, right? Like, does a plant have free will? Are plants evolving in the direction of having more free will? Are there animals that are evolving in the direction of having less free will? Curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So first of all, let me just say, just for conventional reasons, I restrict the usage of the term free will to human beings, just because it has so much sort of philosophical, metaphysical baggage that I don't want to invite controversy where I don't need to. So, but I think we can talk about agency. Okay, so is a bacterium an agent? Yeah, I would say that it is. Even though it has pre-configured control policies, it still needs to make all things considered judgments to actually get around in the real world, right? Not in the lab where we just expose it to one thing at a time and we see what happens. It's like in the real, like in a biofilm in your gut or something, there's all kinds of stuff happening, right? It's a big, complicated ecosystem. And even so, bacteria have to make holistic, integrative kinds of behavioral adjustments, let's say. I don't want to say decisions, because again, all the terms that we have here are really anthropomorphic and loaded. Right? So plants are a really interesting case, because plants have basically chosen the lifestyle of just sitting around, right? They don't really need to do a lot of behavioral control because they can't move in the world. Now they can move their bits, and they do move their bits in ways that we can see, right? They turn their flowers towards the sun, or leaves towards the sun, or they make other kinds of movements. I mean, there's some that capture insects and stuff like that, but mostly they don't have that same kind of behavior through fast movement in the world. However, they do, and people argue that they do have behavior through growth, right? They're just such a different kind of thing, such a different kind of entity, and they can behave by, for example, sending their roots to grow lower towards water and so on, or growing higher to get past, to get the sunlight past other plants and so on. So, you can talk about plants in a sense as if they are agents, and I think that's reasonable, although it's a different kind of agency. And here, it gets into an interesting point about whether it makes any sense to press on these words too hard and to try and make sharp dividing lines between something that is an agent versus something that definitely isn't. I'd rather think that there's probably a continuum or even in a kind of an array of ways in which agency can be expressed that depends on the ecology of the organism, the life history of the organism, and what makes sense, right? Because all of these things, right, these systems of behavioral control are expensive. They're energetically super expensive, right? Brains use up like a huge amount of our power given the size of them. So there has to be a payoff, and that payoff depends on what kind of a world you're living in, what kind of a life history you're trying to progress, and so on. And plants do just fine with the sitting around, not having to have a brain style. So yeah, so I prefer to think of a diversity of types of agency and maybe degrees of agency as well that you could define in terms of, say, cognitive time horizons, or how many things you could think about, or cognitive depth in some way, or complexity, or behavioral flexibility, or there's various ways that you can think about it as more or less. I like to think about it as different as well.
Yeah, that's a good point about defining agency as separate from free will. I think it's interesting that I guess there's a bit of an avoidance of the question of like, well, when are we at zero agency, like exactly zero agency, versus when do we have like an infinitesimally small amount of agency?
Right. But that becomes but that's interesting because like it varies across species, but it also varies across individuals, and it varies across lifetimes. I mean, I would say babies have less agency than adults have, in the sense that they can't control their behavior as well. They can't actually just physically control their movement as well. They're not thinking as far in the future. They don't have as much to think about because they haven't developed their cognition yet, and so on and so on. And that's why we don't blame babies when they do stupid things. And and we don't blame children as much as we blame adults, and we don't hold them morally responsible, and we don't hold them legally responsible. And of course, as I mentioned at the start, that's also true for people who have psychiatric illness. We don't hold them as responsible because we recognize that they have less free will or less rational control of their behavior than healthy people do. We recognize that drug addicts have less rational control of their behavior. We recognize that someone who's inebriated or has been hit in the head or who's exhausted or really hungry has less control. So yeah, I think it's just makes a lot of sense to think of these terms in a quantitative and qualitatively varying kind of a way. I'm sorry, I know I cut across you there, Ethan, when I didn't know if you had a follow-up to the end of your sentence or a question.
No, this is good. I mean, I was thinking about the same things, right? Yeah, I mean, we talk about people who are high agency versus low agency, and then there are all the different categories of people, right? Like babies.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just at a family event yesterday, and we had to be at like different places at different times, and of course, like, I mean, the adults, it was very easy to say like, okay, well, we have to be here by X time, right? But the little kids, they don't have any conception of that, and of course, and
they literally
their parents have to do the best they can to kind of corral their kids' behavior.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, even within perfectly healthy adults, of course, there's differences in the degree of, say, impulsivity or conscientiousness or ability to plan or persevere or delay gratification, and all of those kind of personality traits and elements of executive function that vary between individuals. So you could say even that some people have more free will than others, or a greater ability to exercise it than others do. Yeah. Which just gets back to the idea that we shouldn't think in absolute terms. It's not, the choices are not either you have absolutely no freedom whatsoever or you have absolutely complete freedom at all times, right? Those are just not our only choices, and we're somewhere in the middle. Sometimes we're over here, and sometimes we're over there, and some people are over here, and some are over there, and yeah, so it's just much more kind of I guess a nuanced view that we need, not this absolutist all or nothing kind of yes or no bright line view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess the reason why I am interested in like the difference between zero agency and like an infinitesimally small amount of agency is just, how did agency come to be? I mean, was there a point in the universe like prior to the evolution of life that agency didn't exist.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden it does. And did it begin existing like when there was unicellular form of life, or only when animals kind of broke off from the evolutionary tree?
I would say, yeah, if there's any bright line, I would say it's with the origin of life itself. Yeah, and that's, you know, that's not that sharp a line, and we don't know what it looked like. But I would say that division between living and non-living, you know, I would say agency as we know it now is coextensive with life. What becomes interesting is whether we could have artificial systems that we think have some degree of autonomous agency because they're constructed in the right kind of way, where we'd say, well, is it alive? You know, I think we may generate edge cases where things get very fuzzy, and that's a whole interesting other topic.
Yeah, no, that's another thing, a fun thing to get into. I mean, I just think about the case of a self-driving car, right? I mean, it clearly would have some impact on the world, the decisions that it makes, and I mean, the way that it's programmed. It either is programmed deterministically, like, okay, well, if you see X, Y, and Z signal, then do this, or it can be programmed probabilistically in that, like, well, you're gonna have to, like, there might be an ambiguous situation, you might have to make a random decision, or we have to program it in such a way that it doesn't make a decision. So yeah,
not making a decision is a decision. So
yeah.
Yeah.
But
I have a thought on that, but
deterministically programmed one. Yeah.
I have a thought on that, but I'm conscious that
go ahead.
That Jenny and Mark wanted to get back in. So if there's time, I'll come back to your self-driving car at the end, because there was just a funny thing I thought about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll make this short because I'm curious about the self-driving car thing too. I think this idea of it being a spectrum, both among different forms of life, but also within individuals, is really interesting. And I think depending on how you come at it, with, let's just take humans, if you're kind of coming from a deterministic tendency, you could say, wow, we have more free will than I realized once you grapple with this. But if you're coming at it from more of a tending to believe in free will, you could say, wow, our free will is way more limited than I realized before. It kind of depends what angle you're coming at it. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, you know, the angle of maybe it's more limited than we realize, I think sometimes about the findings of like social psychology, like how many of our beliefs are due to this kind of outside influence, like way beyond what we realize. You know, most people, if they're born into a religion, they tend to believe in that religion or political ideology or whatever. And it's not like you have a buffet of beliefs saying this one makes sense. You just kind of, you know, take it on to belong. And so, and there's probably so many things like that where there's a kind of undue influence where, and you see this in people who later, if they leave a religion or a political ideology, they'll say, like, wow, I didn't have free will back then. Mm-hmm. I thought I did. I thought these were my own choices. But now I see how much was influenced. Now I feel like I have more free will. And these kinds of influences are definitely not recognized that much by our legal system. I mean, they are in some cases like domestic violence and, you know, certain things, but they're not fully recognized. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about the kind of social psychology element of the.
Yeah. Well, I have only kind of uninformed layman's thoughts about it, but basically I completely agree with you there. There's all kinds of ways that our thinking about various topics is shaped by our upbringing and our environment and our culture and things that we've been exposed to and so on. So, you know, when I was talking earlier about the idea that we're shaped by our own choices, I didn't want to give the impression that that's complete, like we have complete freedom to shape ourselves however we want to be. Of course, we're constrained by the experiences that we're having, and you know, if grown-ups are telling us as children that such and such is the case, or such and such is a good thing to do or a bad thing to do, then you know, it's perfectly unsurprising that we might incorporate those ideas into our own sets of policies and beliefs. So all of which, you know, is a picture, like I said, it's just very nuanced, right? And that's, I think, exactly what we need to bring to this, is some nuance. It's partly why I'll take a last swipe at Robert Sapolsky, even though he's not here. But partly his motivation is this sort of railing against the injustices of, or the unfairness of, in particular, the American justice system, where he thinks that the legal system doesn't take enough account of people's upbringing or their genetics or the way that they're constituted and the various circumstances they found themselves in through their lifetime, which can constrain their choices. Now, I could perfectly agree with that without resting that argument on a metaphysical claim that no one has any free will whatsoever, ever, right? So he wants it to be zero in everybody all the time. And to me, that actually undercuts his argument, because what is he noticing then about how some people's are more constrained than others by their upbringing? Like, how could you be more constrained than zero? We're all at zero. What are you talking about? So it becomes a weird argument, I think, and a self-defeating argument, because I completely agree with him that we should take account of all these influences and that we shouldn't have this absolutist, metaphysical, magical sense of free will. In fact, I'd much rather just talk about things like executive function and rational control and impulsivity and this sort of the socio-cultural beliefs and contexts in which we operate. That all makes perfect sense. We're trying to understand someone's behavior. We're trying to judge whether they should be held morally responsible for that behavior. Then all of those considerations should be in the mix. But you can't have any of them in the mix if we're all at zero all the time.
Yeah.
Let me say the thing about the car. Just the idea that so there's this in the history of free will across various religions, there have been lots of different views about whether or not we have free will. And in the Christian tradition, a lot of that was motivated by this so-called problem of evil, right? The idea that human beings clearly are doing things that we take to be evil, right? They're doing bad things, despite the fact that we have an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God. And how does that entity allow these bad things to happen? And so Augustine in the 300 something BC came up with this solution that actually others had come up with before, but that what God did was give us freedom. And then God's off the hook, right? It's like, hey, I gave you free will. You can do what you want. You're to blame, not me. Right? So what's interesting is that I heard this come up in a debate recently about there's a new European law about AI systems that is put in place to kind of try and regulate the industry. And one of the elements that is at play there is whether companies will be held responsible legally for things that their artificial agents do. So if they have a self-driving car, can the company get away with playing the free will card that Augustine played and say, look, hey, this is not our fault. We created this thing with free will. It chose to do that. That's the car's fault. That's not our fault. You can't sue us for that. So it's an interesting kind of a parallel. And actually, I mean, honestly, a live legal debate and discussion going on right now about how much these kinds of companies can be held responsible for the actions of their products once they're released into the wild. I think it's a really, really interesting time where these sort of metaphysical semantic arguments that we've been having are going to get cashed out in very real terms in the real world, and especially in clear legal terms. It's going to be an interesting next little while, I think. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I do think it's an interesting question. I mean, I feel like it's going to be one of those things where companies who are like companies who create a product can probably be held responsible for it. But if someone like creates an open source thing and it's just kind of like co-created, there isn't any single owner of a machine or a language model, and there's no one that you can really hold to account. I think that will, that'll scramble things a bit.
Well, absolutely, and well, scrambling is the term, because we're the legal sort of systems are scrambling to catch up with the pace of the technology.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today, and special thanks to Dr. Kevin Mitchell for his wonderful, wonderful presentation, his wonderful answers. And personally, I really did appreciate it, and I hope everyone did so too. You can, of course, buy Dr. Mitchell's book via Amazon and his and various other websites, and I encourage you all to do so. Thank you, everyone. And I hope everyone has a nice evening, middle of the day. It depends where you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Arkadiusz, and thank you all so much for coming and for your great questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.